that some of the New Yorkers and New Jerseyers might be swimming to their office to get to the phone and help with business entities' legal structure. So our sympathies with all of the New Yorkers and New Jersey, Connecticut folks who are stuck with this problem. Luckily, those of us in D.C. just slightly dodged the bullet, so we're very grateful. Mike Bennett has had some onward discussions over the week on the previous work we had done to establish the structure of legal entities, incorporated companies, and et cetera. Mike's going to show you what has transpired from those conversations. Our goal is to see if we can get some sign-off on that, and then we will go into the basic structure of funds, trusts, and partnerships. So, Mr. Bennett.
Thanks, Mike. So, apologies that my other machine is slowly joining us, and it will be with us in about 1 to 2 minutes, by which time I'm sure more people will have joined as well. But
if you want to turn it over to me, Mike, I can show your slide that you showed me yesterday.
Sure. Yeah, let's start with that. Fantastic. Thanks, Mike. Here it comes.
All right. Well, I got to find it, of course, but.
There you go.
Okay, I assume everybody can see that. Take it away, Mike.
Excellent. So basically, I've been going through the observations log, which I'm sure you've seen on the website, where I've been recording everybody's comments, questions, both in session and on email and so on. And there was 2 or 3 questions which have raised a similar idea, and that was that to be a legal entity is itself a contextual construct, that since being a legal entity means being something that has contractual capability, there's actually a lot of very complex cross-border issues and so on around what it actually means to be recognized as having some contractual capability, and all sorts of interesting instruments around that. To simplify that slightly, there's certainly a jurisdictional aspect to that. So I'd slightly resisted being overly philosophical, but every time something is a meaningful concept, but the concept requires some context in order to even exist, then we call it what we call a relative thing. And this is based on some of the underlying philosophy we've been working with over the years, that basically defines everything that can be defined as either an independent thing in itself, like a person or a company or something, or a thing in some context, like a client, a counterparty, anything which is relative to some context. So the proposal was to define legal entity as one of these relative or contextual types of thing. I was afraid of making the model overly complex, but we had a really detailed discussion about this on a particular academic think tank called the Open Financial Data Group, where this idea was impressed on me again, along with lots of encouragement to perhaps look more closely at the work of John Searle and somebody called Bungay on the way that social constructs are constructed. And I have been going through Searle, but I don't think it affects the model at this level, other than to encourage us in this idea that some constructs, that even if they're social, are independent things, like legal persons, body corporate, and so on, as we have them. So that kind of confirms that, because there was some suggestion that those could be regarded as relative things as well, which just didn't sit right. But the legal entity, that is anything defined as having contractual capability, is thereby a relative thing. It's recognized as having that capability in some context or some jurisdiction. So without really significantly changing the agreed definitions and meanings that we have. We've already agreed that by legal entity we mean something with contractual capability. I realized that what actually seems to be a complexity in the model of using this relative thing concept actually simplifies the model considerably, and in particular simplifies any structure you might want to build a physical application around, or an operational ontology or something, because that which is recognized as having contractual capability, like any relative thing, that relative thing has not only a context in which it's defined, which in this case I've defined as the jurisdiction. It may be more complex than that, and that's something we can tease out a bit later, but it has that context. The second thing that's always true of some relative thing is that there is always some independent thing which stands in that role. So if a relative thing is a thing in a role, like a client, a customer, a mother, a counterparty, and in this case a legal entity, then it must always have an identity relationship which defines what is the independent kind of thing which can fulfill that role. And here I've brought together a lot of the terms in the taxonomy and simplified them slightly, because actually everything that we're talking about here is some kind of formal organization. That is, some organization that has some formal arrangement among its principles, which we've defined as the organization covering agreement. And so we already had that things like foundation, trust, partnership, and so on were all formal organizations. Separately, we had this concept of legal personhood, what we provisionally labeled last time as liable entity. The legal term that's most often used for that is legal person. And we said on the last session that we might revisit that label pending some legal advice. But whatever we choose to call it, this is some entity which has the capacity for liability. We've defined that not as a relative thing, but still as an independent thing, but simply as a kind of autonomous entity. It's created as an autonomous entity by some act of legal fiction. That's the body corporate, sorry, but it's something which has some liability and divides down, as we agreed before, into a body corporate or artificial person. A natural person is also a liable entity, but is not a formal organization, and a sovereign also is a liable entity. And we said last time that rather than make those three go directly under the top of the hierarchy, since they all had in common some capacity for liability, we defined that liable entity or legal person as a common concept. But what I've changed slightly here, which I think was a mistake already, was that a body corporate or artificial legal person, is what it is always a formal organization. So previously we had each of the things below body corporate, the legally incorporated partnership, the incorporated company, the company limited by guarantee, and any other types of body corporate that we might find. We had each of those separately shown as a subtype of formal organization. That seems overly complex, because in order to register something using some instrument of incorporation as a artificial legal person or body corporate, one has to have some formal organization. You create the organization at that point, but it has to be more than one person. An individual can't suddenly become a body corporate. So it's always a formal organization, and that hugely simplifies the amount of multiple inheritance that we use in the model. And it allows us to say that the thing that we're really interested in from a legal entity point of view, the kinds of things that we would want to give a legal entity identifier to, are all formal organizations. And then the kind of formal organization may be a artificial person or body corporate, or it may be a trust or something like that. And there's some uncertainty around where exactly foundation lives in that, but that's for another time. So that simplified hierarchy of kinds of formal organization on the one hand, and the definition of legal entity as a relative concept, a thing in a context, in this case the context being some jurisdiction,
Okay, so that's the rationale. Let's make sure that there is no concern about that, or whether whether that resonates with other folks. Because I think you've made your case.
Great, thanks, Mike. So delighted to hear people's comments and questions and thoughts on that.
I have released a couple of lines for people who are on telephones. Anyone who's on voice over IP, if you'd like to raise your hand from the control panel if you have some comments, and I'll release your lines.
Wonderful. Silence is assent.
Fantastic. So good. So I will. I'll update the observations log to put this as our suggested answer to those points. I think it is although it's slightly complex, it's a fairly well attested idea, and I'm quite comfortable with how it's simplified the independent thing, the left-hand side of the hierarchy, into what are formal organisations and so on. It seems to put everything accurately in the right place with the right kind of properties about it and so on. So somehow I've lost the questions queue. Were there no questions at all in the question queue? Well, that's fantastic.
No, there are no questions.
Okay, good. So
you got it, Mike. Move on.
I've got it. Fantastic. Thank you.
Is your computer up and?
I don't know what it's doing. It's been sitting here. I've got one screen in which I clicked on Join Webinar in Progress. I filled in my name and computer name and all the rest of it, and it's.
You want me to go to the repository and show funds?
Yeah, it's not the prettiest view of funds. Oh no, go to the repository and show business entities, and go to the diagrams on business entities, and that will show us something more sensitive. And I'm still battling away with this machine to make it do something. So joining webinar. Let me try that again. Right. So under business entities, diagrams. So you see we've got the previous diagram for the overview, then we've got trusts overview. Let's have a look at trust overview, and we also have funds concepts. So I'll quickly talk to the trusts. I scrunched this diagram a bit smaller so it's easy to get it on one page, but basically this is the very basic model of trusts that we came up with in the previous series of reviews, and then we decided there's a lot more to this than that we still need to understand, but that these are pretty much the basics. And the reason I want to look at, well, let's start with funds actually. Be aware that the trust model is there. We'll come back to it, because what we want to identify is what is the range of kinds of thing that can be related to some fund. And this is a very rough diagram from the previous funds-related research. So I'll give you a little bit of the history of that. The fund model is part of the instruments section, and like all of the material, like by essentially looking at the ISO 20022 Financial Industry Business Information Model, or FIBO-BE. The model was worked on by a group called Working Group 11 some time ago, and in fact one of the participants of Working Group 11 was from the European Fund and Asset Management Association, or IFAMA. But there were also fund-related folks from Australia, from South Africa, and from the US. And they all had different comments and questions, and in fact this was the kind of place where it became difficult for people to comment on logical model design and align it with their business knowledge. And in particular, the Australians had some interesting variations in how funds work there. So we then reverse engineered all that stuff into this semantics format, and I took it over to Rotterdam in Holland and had a few sessions with some business folks from IFAMA itself, the European Fund and Asset Management Association. And we basically started with a complete whiteboard. These guys were not modelers, they weren't technical people at all. I explained just enough of the modeling notation to them that we could capture their knowledge of things. And the first thing that we came up with, which was very interesting, is that, because I know nothing about funds, so I have no preconceptions in this area at all. I'm just trying to be the scribe for what folks like IFAMA were telling us. The first and interesting thing was that the word fund is used in up to 3 different ways, often interchangeably as if they're the same thing, because for the practical purposes of the context you're in, they may well be the same thing. But when it comes to articulating what is the nature of things, we need to separate these things out. So the 3 things are, on the left there, a fund unit. And this has various subtypes like fund equity unit and fund debt unit and so on. But usually it's equity. So the typical scenario is that you buy equity in a fund. So somebody sets up a fund, whether it's open or closed-ended, has different implications for the equity. But basically you have a fund set up. It's got a portfolio of assets that it holds. That's then defined as some kind of entity, some kind of legal or even legal person type of entity, perhaps. And some equity is created in that entity, and when you buy the fund, you're buying some units of equity which make you essentially a shareholder or equity holder in that fund, and your equity goes up and down as the overall equity of the fund goes up and down. So you talk about buying a fund when what you're actually buying is a contract, which is exactly analogous to a share, which is also a contract. So that's one thing when you talk about a fund, is the fund unit. Now, separately from that is the fund as, and the thing we settled on was a pool. In fact, the IFAMA guys were quite insistent about this. So the fund, in its actual essence, is a pool of assets. And it's that pool of assets that has sub-funds, it has different parties that relate to it, like fund administrator and fund accountant and so on. So some of those parties, the fund administrator particularly, will be some kind of legal entity, probably a kind of legal person or liable entity, but it's not the same as the fund itself. And that brings us to the third thing, which is the entity which is actually the legal form of the fund itself. And in here I expect a lot of jurisdictional variation over and above what we captured from the IFAMA folks. In particular, you'll see that I've not captured anything about trust funds here, which I think are a particularly British thing, and I'm sure there must be other places that have them as well. So this was, so the stuff on the right is very, very provisional, and there may well be some tautology in there as well, which we can come to. But basically, when you talk about the fund, sometimes you're talking about the entity. So if you walk into a big fund management company like Robeco or somewhere, and you look on the wall, there's a whole board with different names of registered companies up there, legal person, and each of those is a fund. And so when you create a new fund, you register a new legal person of some sort, and it is that of which there's equity issued, and it's an equity which is defined by the fund units that people hold when they buy equity in that fund. Now, clearly, with a trust fund, there isn't equity, so it must work in some other way, which I know nothing about. But that's the first thing I wanted to cover, is how we can often use the word fund interchangeably between the equity unit or other unit that you hold in a fund as an investor, the fund as a thing, and it's a kind of pool, and it has portfolios, and it has, there's loads of other stuff in the model, strategies and all sorts of things like that, prospectuses, of course, and then it has some legal form. And out of the legal forms we've figured out so far, we talked last time about the fund special purpose vehicle, and we agreed that that's a kind of functional entity, another of our relative things. This is something where to be a fund special purpose vehicle is to be a fund special purpose vehicle. It's the function of the thing. The form that may take may well be a limited company, it may be, I don't know, a trust or something, it may be a partnership. I don't know what ranges of forms that can take, but that it is some form that it takes as a special purpose vehicle. Now, what I don't know and would be interested to find out is whether that's just a different way of saying the same thing as when a fund is registered as a kind of legal person, and it's that legal person that the equity is in, or are those two different things? We'll come to that. And the third thing is that some funds have not a legal person or legal entity or artificial person or anything else like that, but a contract. So there's some contract that defines the fund. And I imagine, although I know nothing about this, that something which is defined by a contract like that is just another example of what we call our formal organisation. You know, any formal organisation has its formalism in the fact that there's some contract among its principals, just as a trust, which is a kind of formal organisation, has a contract with particular roles and responsibilities. Those roles and responsibilities may well be set out in statute or something, but the contract defines the structure of the trust, who is the trustee, who is the beneficiary, and so on. Is the fund that has some contractual basis something like that? If so, is it any different from a trust fund? Is a trust fund a special type of that kind of thing? So that's where we've got to so far, and this is the bit where we need people's knowledge and understanding of the fund world. But firstly, does my explanation of the three separate things themselves that have the word fund attached to them, does that make sense? You know, bearing in mind this is not a vocabulary, we don't worry about words, we want to capture the essence of each kind of thing and then find the most useful label for it, but the label isn't the meaning. The three things we call fund as equity, a pool of assets, and some formal business entity. Is everybody clear with that? Are there any exceptions or differences?
We have a couple of questions, Mike.
Fantastic, thank you.
Okay, first of all, I believe Max Gilmore, your line is released. Max? Okay. Max was asking, he noted, and this was a little bit earlier, but I couldn't interject.
Sorry.
Hello, Max. Sorry. Well done. Here we are.
Sorry, I'm here now. I've unmuted myself. My question went back to a little bit earlier when you were talking about legal entities, and I was wondering, obviously an individual can have legal capacity. That doesn't necessarily make them a legal entity, but have you considered legal capacity in the context of individuals?
Yes. So because we have the artificial legal person as a subtype of legal person or liable entity, another subtype of that liable entity is a human being that's, and again there's some refinement to be made which we haven't yet attempted. You've got human beings as autonomous entities, you have minors, you have other human beings without legal capacity, which we haven't yet added, but we should, and we have human beings who have reached the age of majority in a given jurisdiction. Again, there was a suggestion that that should also be a relative thing, because the same person may be at the age of majority at different ages in different jurisdictions, and I haven't yet attempted that, but I think you might want to think about that. But as we have it right here, you see underneath liable entity, you've got the body corporate or artificial legal person, then you have a natural person, which we believe is the best legal term for a adult natural person, or a natural person who is a legal person and a human being. Is that what you were looking for, Max?
Yeah, that's fine. I guess the legal capacity isn't explicitly there, but I can see how it's constructed.
When you say legal capacity isn't explicitly there which legal capacity. We have the capacity for
of a
liability.
natural person. So
Yeah.
as a liable entity, they have legal capacity, do they?
They have a capacity for liability, yes. We haven't tried to model the other kinds of capacity they may have, although at the very highest level, all autonomous entities have or may have some legal capacity, and that's then refined down to the different capacities. So we haven't tried to model the rights that people have. And some of the work we're doing elsewhere, looking back at John Searle's work before I try and do much more with it, we have rights and obligations as separate facets of some overall kind of social or what they call a deontic construct. But the one we're interested in here really is the, I used to just call it liability, and I realized it wasn't clear enough what we really meant, since it's under legal capacity, as a capacity for liability. So I did quietly relabel that from liability to liability capacity in the hopes that it's a little clearer.
That's fine. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. And there was another question?
Yes, William Freeman. I'm going to try and mute your line, see if your question. William? Can you hear us, William?
Yes, I can.
Hi.
Bill.
Hi. Good morning. Good afternoon. Whatever.
Yeah. Well, you're underwater in Rhode Island.
When you were talking about the funds, I know you had the concept of the legal form, but does QSIP become relevant in the model? I think you have it there in general.
Right.
Wondering if it needs to be specific. Then
That's a very good point. Now, the good news is I've managed to wrestle my other machine onto the session. So, Mike, are you okay for me to take control back and hand it across to my rogue PC now, and I can onto Bill's question on the screen?
I'll change it. You want it to Mike FIBO?
I'm just about to do it. I'm checking with Mike Atkin whether he's okay with it. Let's not crash into each other. No, you just, okay. I was literally about to push the button and do it. I was just, bear with me a moment now. I'll start that again. I just didn't want to snatch the screen away from Mike without at least saying I was doing so first. So here we are. So now, of course, this will take a minute to actually see it. Okay, so one of the conversations we had with the IFAMA folks, and this is how we focused in on what were the different things that were meant by fund, that when one talked about holding a fund or holding some equity in a fund, the thing one bought and sold to do that one was talking about was a thing with an ISIN. Of course, we were in Europe, so we didn't use words like QSIP, but basically
Sorry,
that
Mike,
was how we focused.
Sorry, Mike,
Yeah?
can you show your screen? It is not showing.
I know it's not. It takes. I've clicked the buttons to make it show. It always takes a minute for it to show once I've clicked that button. It is on its way, I promise you. And I thought while I'm waiting for it to do that, I would answer Bill's question and segue into the screen that we're going to see. In fact, I was just changing the screen then, and I stopped. So you're now seeing my screen. Now give me another moment while I pull up the window I was pulling up, and we should all be in a good place. So here we are. And I think my line's probably a bit slow, so it may take a while before you see it, but I can see it now. The conversation we had was that in order to identify what they meant by fund in these three different contexts, the three different things that are referred to as fund, one of them was something which definitely has an ISIN, and that was how we were able to say, well, if you're talking about something that definitely has an ISIN, then you're talking about something that is a kind of security. Maybe it shouldn't even just be shown as a kind of transferable contract, but maybe it should have security as a parent. That's something I'm not sure about. But it's definitely something like a security that has an ISIN or a QSIP or some other security identifier. And that's how you know that when somebody's using the word fund and the thing they're referring to is something with a QSIP or an ISIN, then it's one of these things on the left. So it was exactly the question, Bill, that you just asked, which helps us to focus in on these different concepts that are meant by fund. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does.
Fantastic. And can you all see my screen now?
Yes, we can. I have a comment
Thank
from Robert Schmidt.
Hi, Robert.
Robert, do you want to ask your question? Robert? Oh, he just didn't hear you. Can you just repeat what you were doing, what you were saying on that last part?
Sure. So Bill Freeman asked about with these different concepts of fund, the importance of something with a QSIP, and my response was that was very similar to the conversation I had with the Afama folks when we were distinguishing the things that one means by fund, because sometimes one's talking about a thing with an ISIN, or which would obviously in North America it would be something with a QSIP, something with an identifier that's a security identifier. We haven't shown that here, and I'm thinking that this should probably have security as a parent, and maybe the reason it isn't is that there's some differences that we need to dig into when we come to look at funds in detail. But basically a fund in the sense of something with an identifier would be this thing that's a contract, and I don't know why the identifier isn't there after having had that conversation, but there must be some detailed modeling that we needed to do there. But that was how we distinguished, when you talk about fund, in some context, what you're actually talking about is a kind of security, and the way that we know you're talking about a kind of security is that you're referring to something which you know has an ISIN or a QSIP or some other security identifier. Is that a bit clearer?
I think so. Robert at the moment hasn't got audio.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks, Robert. Let me know if that needs to be more clearly articulated, because we did struggle with this, starting from words people use and teasing out the concepts they refer to, because in the same breath as talking about something with a QSIP or an ISIN, one might find oneself talking about something which is some kind of formal organization, or some kind of artificial legal person, or some kind of trust, or some kind of joint stock company, or even something which is just defined in some contract. So where we are now is that we've got a very rough model here from when we looked at this before. It's probably very jurisdiction specific, it's not very complete, and what we need to do as part of this business entities modeling is to make sure that we've defined and captured what are the kinds of entities that need to be modeled as entities and which are needed for any use case involving funds. We agreed that whereas that was previously going to be in scope of the future release, we now want it to be in scope of this first version of FIBO business entities, because it would be no use without it. So I'd like to hear people's views of what are the kinds of entities which could fulfill the entity definition of those three meanings of fund. What are the kinds of things that can be a fund, and where does special purpose vehicle fit in? We have special purpose vehicle as a thing which is defined in some context. We have other SPVs for things like securities issuance and so on. Mortgage-backed securities and so on tend to have SPVs, but we have a funds SPV. How does that differ, if at all, from referring to the fund as a kind of legal person? And what about trust funds? Presumably they don't have equity units, so how does a trust relate to a fund in the world? So I just want to try and capture the basic facts as best that we can and work out how to then relate different kinds of fund to different kinds of entity. This will obviously differ a lot from one jurisdiction to another, so I think we've got a fair bit of work to do on that. really over to you. Okay, I've just finally found the questions queue again. Right, so I want to try and work out what it will take to get from where we are now to better knowledge of the funds area. One thing I think we should certainly add to that part of the model is the trust. Does anybody here know about trust funds, or how those may vary, or what kinds of things they may be, or anything like that? Because I don't.
I have some knowledge of trust funds in Australia, Mike.
Oh, good, because Australia was some of the jurisdictional variations that we started to try and capture on Working Group 11 and didn't really do justice to. So, yeah, please do tell.
So, again, I think that the term is used fairly loosely, because what you have is a trust as an entity that is controlling a portfolio. So it fits in exactly the same as any other fund. The term trust fund is used to represent that combination.
Now let's have a look at something on that then, because represent that combination. One of the things in the more detailed fund model was the different entities that are involved with the fund, including the fund administrator. So if certainly in Holland or somewhere you register an entity which is the fund, that's a different entity from the party, notice the party icon, which means some entity in some role. The entity which administers the fund is a different entity from the entity which is the fund, in certainly that European example. For our Australian trust fund, are they the same entity, or is the trust fund so called because the fund administrator takes the form of a trust? And what form then does the trust itself take?
Well, the trustee, of course, is created with the trust. So your trust has to have a trustee. I would have said that a trust fund is simply a trust that has been set up for the sole purpose of managing a fund. A trust could, of course, be set up for the purpose of managing the affairs of a person without capacity.
That's right. Yeah.
So in the circumstances where you're talking about a trust fund, the fund, of course, may be registered.
Right, meaning that it's a registered legal person.
Yeah. It's a register. It's a portfolio that's registered, and it's basically registering the trustee, the funds that are being managed, because there may be contractual, or basically the prospectus of the fund may have limitations, etc., and to gain trustee status, which will give you tax breaks, etc., you have to, and also to allow some investors to invest in those portfolios. They may be restricted to only investing in trustee securities. Then you're registering your fund or your portfolio of the fund with the relevant authorities. I'm not 100% sure. I think it's APRA. And of course, that then places onus on the controlling entity, which is almost always a trustee, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a corporation, can be a trustee.
Right. Yes, a trustee can be any kind of entity, whether it's a human being or a corporation, as long as it's a legal person, doesn't it?
Yeah. And so that I'm not 100% clear on this because I haven't been directly involved in it, but that would then become, the trust fund would be referenced in that way. But basically, you're talking about a trust whose portfolio is registered, and therefore it's a trust fund or a recognised, a registered trustee, and a registered trustee investment.
Right. So its portfolio is registered with some suitable authority that has oversight.
Yes, I believe in Australia that's APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority. But it could
right,
be
and that's how they regulate that. Right.
Yes.
So then, when a fund has certain declared investment restrictions, and these are all in the detailed fund model. We have the idea of fund policy, fund strategy, investment restrictions. Because to sell funds to the public, you have to be able to prove that. If you said it's a high net, emerging markets fund or a high tech fund or whatever, you have to have certain percentages held in certain kinds of share or certain regions or certain industry sectors.
And those limitations would be incorporated in the trust deed.
Ah, that's interesting. So if we go to I hesitate to dive into the detailed model, but we'll take a quick look at it. If you go into the detailed model and some of the things we have on, so I can find it now. Simple. There's things that have to go in a prospectus, and you have to, the regulatory authorities are there to make sure that what you've marketed it as and sold it as to the public is what it actually is, and you have all that strategy and so on somewhere down here. So you have your portfolios, you have your holdings in your portfolios and so on. You have your benchmarks and so on, so you get that. Investment policy, investment limitations and so on, your different strategies, which are really limitations. All of that is actually in a trust fund, actually included in the deeds of the trust fund itself.
Yes.
Is what you're saying.
That's
fantastic.
right.
Yeah, because all that links back to the prospectus. Right, this is great. So I'm going to jot that down. So anybody from the UK or anywhere else where there are trust funds, do you have them in the United States or not? Any variations on that?
We have some unusual limitations because of our tax breaks on superannuation.
Right. Yeah, because what I'm wondering is how universal some of these things are, but it certainly makes some sense. And let's actually go and look at the trust figure again now, because this might be a good time to let's get rid of that character. So now our legal entity relative thing, this diagram has slightly rearranged itself from the one I circulated, but it's basically the same thing. So here's the trust as a formal organisation. Because it's a formal organisation, it's governed by some covering agreement. That's narrowed down in the case of the trust, that it's a trust agreement, or I think deed is a, I haven't got that as a synonym for some reason, but I believe that's usually called the deeds of the trust. And that sets out in the agreement, it defines three parties: a sponsor, beneficiary, and trustee. So this could be a trust for organising somebody's affairs, it could be a trust for all sorts of things. For funds then, if it's a trust fund, the beneficiary is the fund and the trustee is the fund administrator. Is that how it works?
Well, typically in a trust fund, it would probably be a unit trust. So the beneficiaries are the unit holders, although that isn't essential. You could, because typically these funds are being broken down and offered to investors.
Right. So the unit holders, so the so if you've got 100 investors or 1,000 investors or whatever, each of those is a trustee. Sorry, a beneficiary.
A trustee, a trust beneficiary, yes.
Beneficiary, got it, right. We can actually put that in if we like. for a fund unit holder would be beneficiary. And the trustee, if I remember right from what you were just saying, is the fund administrator. Is that right?
The trustee is the person who's legally responsible for that trust and its actions. He's required to act in a fiduciary capacity with the beneficiaries, and he would be appointed by the sponsor.
Right, now that's true of all types of trust, right?
I think so, yes.
Right, so in the case of funds, how does that...
I don't think it differs. I think the only difference is that the fund in that circumstance is a special purpose vehicle, and the trustee undertakes to comply with his deed, and that because of that undertaking, it gets registered as security with trustee status, which gives you access to investors who are limited in what they can invest in.
Right. Is anybody yet seeing any jurisdictional variations or any differences between this and what they see in the United States or Canada or the UK or Europe or anywhere?
Mike, it's hard to know, but I have a question. I mean, between like the SEC, which has to be reported to on these very things, the DTCC, even some of the scheme out of XBRL, which the mutual fund companies report through, and with what you have here, it may be that there is kind of a Venn diagram that could be formulated, because I know a lot of this stuff is in place, not exactly like this, but certainly, you know, these definitions and the actions and the verbs have been, you know, they're doing this now to a greater or lesser degree. So I just thought I'd mention that because it might be worth looking at that just to see and compare and you know, gain any benefit from what people may have done before.
Absolutely, and what we want to do is find the sources of knowledge. This is why we went to IFAMA. If you can point us to documents that define these kinds of things, that's why we have the business subject matter experts on these calls, to point us to the knowledge that we need, because what we want to do is represent, you know, we're not creating a technical model or anything, as you know, Bill. We're trying to represent as accurately as possible the way the world is. So if you've got any pointers to those kinds of documents, or anybody else does, that would be exactly what we need. And since we're just using basic set theoretic constructs in this model, there's nothing we shouldn't be able to model once we find the right business knowledge and capture it. So I think what Max has been giving us gives me a lot more structure I can put around this, and we can then say, well, is there a slightly different structure or an analogous structure or a more general structure in the US, for example, when we have a look at those documents. But if anybody can point us to the stuff that Bill's talking about, including Bill, that would be really greatly appreciated. Good. So just to jump back to the point that Max made that I just wanted to pick up. You mentioned the fund is an SPV in a sentence just now, and again, that's funds as three things. There's one of them. So we're talking about in a trust fund where the beneficiaries are fund unit holders, and the trustee is a trustee as defined for any trust, but their responsibilities are specific to the fund. There's then
I don't think they're typically
an
referred
SPV.
to as.
Ah.
I don't think they're typically referred to as an SPV. An SPV is they certainly act in the same capacity. They're managing a portfolio of investments or a portfolio of assets, and their purpose in that scenario is exclusively for that, and of course that aligns with the concept of a special purpose vehicle, but I haven't actually heard them expressed as a special purpose vehicle explicitly. Typically, a special purpose vehicle would be referring to a company, a corporation.
Well, that's right. A special purpose vehicle is
set up wholly and solely for that purpose.
That's right. A special purpose vehicle, in general, is some entity that's been set up for some special purpose, but the kind of entity it may be a limited company, there's always going to be some legal person, we think. Here is a definition from Vicky Starr. Thank you, Vicky. A US special purpose entity can serve to define the management and administration of the portfolio of assets in the trust, e.g. mortgage-backed securities. Additional terms included in the trust agreement is the collection of monies from the cash flows generated by the assets, payment of the monies to investors, that's the beneficiaries, and conditional actions if the terms of the trust agreement, which includes the financial contracts represented by assets in the trust, are not fulfilled. Fantastic. Now, Vicky, that sounds to me completely compatible with what Max is describing. So it sounds like we've got a pretty general model with perhaps jurisdictional variations down in the details. Is that your understanding of what we're seeing here, or have I misunderstood anything? Are we talking about the same kind of structure in the US that Max was just describing for Australia?
Victoria, your line is released.
Good morning. This is Vicky Starr from Fannie Mae. Yes, I would agree. These are just some more details for a specific definition in the U.S. in regards to special purpose entities, which are, I'm not going to say they're the same thing as the SPV, but there seems to be a great deal of affinity with the two topics or things.
Thank you. Well, this is great. I think, let me just go to another diagram that actually shows the overall special purpose vehicles, because I wonder if we've even segregated these a bit artificially. A special purpose vehicle is any entity defined by its function, its identity may be one of a number of kinds of legal person or formal legal entity, and we came across SPVs separately in the issuance of mortgage-backed securities and asset-backed securities, and the issuance of certain other kinds of debt instruments, and in funds. But I wonder, have we separated those? You mentioned mortgage-backed securities as being another scenario in which there's a special purpose entity that defines the management and administration of the portfolio. And of course, the mortgage-backed security special purpose vehicle is a kind of portfolio. So is there a clear blue line between the MBS type of special purpose entity and the fund special purpose vehicles for regular funds? Is that an artificial distinction?
Possibly on the same point, I'm not too sure. Robert Schmidt, you raised your hand a few minutes ago while the line's quiet. Can you, have you still got a question?
No, Robert.
Just a thought on that special purpose vehicle. I think where the special purpose vehicle differs from the trust is that the special purpose vehicle acquires a portfolio and then issues securities in its own name. In a trust, of course, you
Right.
buy units in the trust, which is a slightly different concept.
Right, that was what I was wondering. Let me just write that down because that sounds like some of the different scenarios I've heard about in the past. So an SPV acquires a portfolio and
Then issues securities that are effectively collateralized by that portfolio.
Wait, I collateralized that. And here's where we start to get to the non-difference between this and mortgage-backed and asset-backed securities then.
Well, mortgage-backed and asset-backed securities are actually different levels of generalization. A mortgage-backed security is an asset-backed security.
It is,
except
that's a whole long story. It's a specialization. We actually, because the word mortgage-backed security in many jurisdictions is treated as being, by definition, mutually exclusive with asset-backed security, we had to come up with a more general term that was the parent of the two, which we simply called pool-backed security. So that's just labelling, which will vary from one place to another. But you're quite right. They're both pretty much identical in structure and in the way they work and so on. That's why we have a special purpose vehicle in that model at the level of pool-backed security. And of course, the fund is just a kind of pool. So I'm beginning to think the distinction between them is somewhat artificial. Okay, so let me see. There were two things you were describing, weren't there? So you've got a scenario, because I know there are many kinds of funds, so we're not going to obviously have one thing that's a fund and one thing that's a fund entity. We're not expecting to find that. We want to know what are the kinds of entities that we need to know about for legal entities and business entities in general, so we can get this part of the model complete. We're obviously not going to finish the fund model itself. This is in response to a question from Bill on the chat thing. Robert Schmidt was muted. Are you unmuted now, Robert? Are you with us?
Yes, I believe you can hear me now, can you?
Yes, I can, yes.
I was wondering if we've reached a point where the individual organizations represented on this call could take the model back and instantiate or fit the special purpose vehicles like our MVS and other entities, our trusts, into your model to see how well we would fit. I wonder if you think we've reached that level of maturity yet, just as a test.
That's a really good approach. I don't think we have, but I think we're very close to it. I think I'm trying to capture what people are saying and then digest it. And I think once I've digested it and modeled it, that is where I would want us to be, because then the proof of the pudding is the examples. And I guess what I'm struggling with is there's different meaningful concepts on the one hand and different words that people use for things on the other hand. We don't want to be caught out by words. We've seen how easily that happens, but I want to make sure we've captured all the concepts. And so it may be that what one person calls a special purpose vehicle is what another person calls a trust, but I suspect not. I suspect it's the other way around, that that you have funds which are structured using the mechanisms of a trust, and you have the trustees and the beneficiaries and so on. You have funds which are registered as a legal entity and issue equity in them. Are they all the same thing? Are we talking about the same thing in different words? That's what I want to get to the bottom of before I'm confident of sending the model out and getting you to try and fit things in there. What I'd like to know is what are the things, the various SPVs, as you just said, what are those things? So that I know, that's the proof. What are the things that are there that we want to try and fit into buckets of simple, meaningful concepts?
Mike, this is Bill. I was thinking the same thing. Thank you, Robert. My question, in the descriptors and the verbs that you have amongst the entities and classifications here, they're not in any form of code, I'm assuming. They're just labels, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, we're using set theoretic constructs. We're using the logical stuff that's in the OWL language, but that doesn't really matter. What we're using it for is to define set theoretic constructs called things and properties about those things in order to capture the business reality independent of any application. Now, of course, because we use a particular language under the hood that is formally grounded in first order logic, it does make it easier to then put this to work in particularly semantic web applications. But even then, I would imagine, and we're finding so far, you do need to make certain tweaks to that material to actually make a operational ontology for a semantic web application. But we want to use that logic to capture a formal record of how the world is, so that next time somebody creates an application, they're looking at something other than words, other than looking at those SEC regulations or so on, something set theoretic. You mentioned Venn diagrams before. I mean, these are a bit square, but it's basically the same language as Venn diagrams, so that we know that we've captured the reality. And so the trick here is that we're trying very hard to not design something. We're trying to capture how the world is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and I knew that. I just because I guess in my experience being involved with implementing these things, boy, once you because you could probably extract the rules out of this and add to them, and if you run it, boy, that's when you really find out.
Yeah, absolutely, and this goes back to Robert's point about loading up stuff and seeing what works. Absolutely, it's a little bit like one way to make sure that when you write a piece of application code, you start with a requirement specification in the traditional approach, and then you link it back to see whether the thing met the requirements. But another and faster and more agile way of writing an application is, instead of writing the requirement specification, you write the test specification that says these are the tests I'm going to run on your application, and if they pass, that's what the application needed to do. So you're right, you've got to be able to prove that what we have meets the requirements that will be placed upon it. Otherwise, it's not an accurate representation of reality. But at the same time, capturing reality itself has to be independent of any implementation considerations. Otherwise, it becomes a design exercise and not a exercise of capturing the reality. So this is why I keep going back and asking these pedantic questions and making sure I've got it right and going back over it about the relationship between the trust, the trustee, the special purpose vehicle, and so on, because I want to know how the world is. I want to then model formally how the world is, and then what you do in an application to be able to handle data about things in the world, that's the problem for the implementer. But if we model how the world is, at least the implementer's got something to look at that tells them what are the things they're going to be looking at. So that's very much the idea here. Good. So I feel I'm still missing a connection somewhere between the trust structure. Let's go back to the trust structure here. Not that one, but this one. So a trust has the trustee, who has these responsibilities to the trust. It has a fund unit holder, which is a kind of beneficiary. The sponsor, what I haven't modeled here, I don't know if this is always true of trust, appoints the trustee. That's not something I was previously aware of, and it's not reflected in the model. Now, the trust itself then is a formal organization whose formalism is the trust agreement or deed that defines all those relationships and so on. If the trustee is managing a portfolio on behalf of the unit holder, is that the legal form of that kind of trust? It's different from the kind of trust where there is equity in the fund, or is the thing that the trustee is managing itself a registered legal person with legal personhood and so on, a company number from company's house and all that kind of thing, um, in which there is then equity, or are we talking about two different mechanisms for protecting the interests of investment? One when you hold a unit in a trust, and another where you hold equity in a limited company that happens to be a trust. So those two different scenarios, or two aspects of the same scenario. It seems to me that there's at least probably 4 or 5 different ways of managing a portfolio of assets, of ensuring that investors are not let down, that the fund strategy that was advertised in the prospectus when the investor bought it is being adhered to, that you report, or something reports to some regulator to prove that they're adhering to it. There must be more than one mechanism by which all those things can happen. So I'm not expecting to push all of this into one box, but I do want to try and figure out where there's a trust involved. Do we have this stuff we need in the business entities model for trusts? Where there's a special purpose vehicle, do we have the kinds of special purpose vehicle, the kinds of legal entity they can be? Are there ever new kinds of legal person other than a company incorporated by the issue of shares, or a company incorporated by the issue of guarantees? Are there other kinds of legal person, artificial legal person, that we need to know of? What about sovereign wealth funds, for example? How do those work? That's what we need to know. If we don't know it, we need to know where the knowledge is. So trustee is managing a portfolio of assets, special purpose vehicle. So somebody, I think it was, Robert mentioned about loading up the kinds of special purpose vehicle that you have. There's an implicit assumption. Remember, I know nothing whatsoever about funds, so there's an implicit statement there that there's always a special purpose vehicle involved, or there's always something involved which you refer to as a special purpose vehicle, regardless of what form the fund takes. Is that the case, or is it just that there's a particular kind of fund that you interact with which always has a special purpose vehicle to it? Robert?
This is Bob. Robert, I'm not sure I actually understood your question.
Okay, so you said that let's try and fit the various kinds of SPVs and trusts and so on that you have. What are the various kinds of SPVs and trusts and so on? Does every fund that you interact with have an SPV aspect to it, or is that a particular kind of fund that has an SPV, and there's another kind of fund which is a trust, and another kind that is something else, or what?
I actually wrote SPV down as a term that I wanted to talk about with my users. That's not a term that we ordinarily use in the office. Victoria from Fannie Mae, I'm with Wells Fargo, so would be somebody that would understand what I'm talking about when I talk about a mortgage-backed security, and she had identified that as an SPV. But closest to me, the thing that I work with most closely are the mortgage-backed securities. But then, of course, at a leaf level, at an even lower level, we have the mortgages themselves, which would also be a contract. But I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I digress, because I don't think that would constitute a legal entity. It would just be a contract. But the mortgage-backed security would be the example that I would want to fit into this ontology.
Oh, right. I would suggest that mortgage-backed security fits into a completely different part of this ontology, and I was questioning earlier whether I've made it too different, but I'll show you where it is. So under debt securities, and this is not for the current release, we just want to make sure that we've dealt with the business entities, but in the securities model, which is coming next, we did a lot of work some years ago, particularly on bond and debt-related securities, and we have asset-backed, and somewhere in here we have mortgage-backed securities. Now, mortgage-backed securities, as you rightly say, like any kind of security, it's a kind of contract. And again, with funds, one of our three meanings of the word fund was a kind of contract. So there's a kind of contract which is a security. It has an issue date, whether it's there and registered or not, and various things that are generally true of securities. You have a tradable debt instrument, such as a bond. Then those bullet or amortizing, you have structured finance debt instruments, which are cash or synthetic. It all gets quite complex. So somewhere down here you have this pool-backed security instrument, the one I mentioned earlier, that was the parent of both asset-backed and mortgage-backed, because to many of the industry participants, mortgage-backed implies something not being asset-backed, despite, as Max said, in general, one being a type of the other. So that's a pool-backed security. There's the MBS, and it's pass-through, or it's what's the other word? Tranched. We've got different tranches. We've got all sorts of stuff, and we have the pool. And this is actually where there's a real similarity between the fund model and the MBS model, because the second use of the word fund is that it's a pool of assets, and similarly, all these pool-backed securities are backed by some pool of debt, maybe a pool of individual debts, maybe a pool of loans, maybe a pool of there's a lot of other complexity in this diagram, but maybe a pool of mortgages, and so on. So there's a similarity there between the instrument and the pool that underlies it in their mortgage-backed security world, but there's no legal entity implication to this other than the issuer of a mortgage-backed security, it's a party, of course, or it's some entity in some context, is a kind of issuer of any pool-backed security, which is a kind of issuer, maybe that's a kind of security issuer, which is some kind of artificial legal person. But somewhere in here, somewhere, we had, maybe a different diagram, the special purpose vehicle. I don't know where it is, but I know we had it. Okay, and you've got specialist mortgage issuers and so on. Okay, so I'm diagram for that. But that was where we came up with special purpose vehicles for debt issuance. And separately from that was mentioned in the funds model the idea of special purpose vehicles for fund issuance. And it'd be nice to get some kind of commonality, where there are facts in common. It's nice to be able to combine them. It's not the same as trying to combine data elements with design elements, but a matter of discovering commonalities between real things where they exist. So that's intriguing, because I've never really thought of that before.
Mike, you have a comment.
Yep.
I'm sorry, you have a comment from Vicky Starr.
Right.
Vicky, are you there that you can explain your point?
Good morning again. I think my point is that they sound like they're very similar, SPE and SPV, although I am not aware of what the differences are, nor if they're a material difference.
Right. Yes, I did. I saw you when you wrote SPE earlier. I interpreted it as SPV, and that may or may not have been correct.
In the U.S., in regards to mortgage-backed securities, they're issued by agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They are generally considered special purpose entities, which are the MBS Trust.
So when you say they, in that case, not Fannie Mae isn't a special purpose entity, but the MBS Trust
According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, Mike, an SPV or a special purpose entity is the same thing. It's a legal entity created by a firm by transferring assets to the SPV to carry out some specific purpose. And I sent you the document.
Fantastic. So it's created by a firm, that'd be the sponsor or creator of it, by transferring funds to some new entity. Make sure I've written this right. Document to follow. Good. So that's exactly compatible with how we've modelled special purpose vehicles in the past, and it had been noted in our previous fund reviews that one of the legal forms the funds can take, or one of the terms related to a fund is the fund special purpose vehicle. And so we have our taxonomy of kinds of relative business entities. One's a special purpose vehicle, there's the securities issuers SPV, the fund's SPV, and so on. And that's an entity set up specifically to create, in this case, an investment fund that's set up by a company or group of companies for this purpose. SPV is always, of course, created for a specific reason, exists for a specific period of time, is then disbanded. That's in the IFRAMA data dictionary. Good. So I'm trying to get a
quick
handle
question
on.
here.
Yes, Bill.
This is more for Robert. Robert, so how do you categorize a REMIC?
I'm not going to try. I'm much more on data modeling and technical side, but I tell you what I can do is I can go to my users and try to get an answer for you. I'm familiar with REMICs, but I would be way outside my bounds if I tried to characterize it for you.
Because generally they're SPVs, in my understanding. Just curious. Thank you.
I'm thinking now as I hear you talk that it's just simply a matter of office jargon that they just don't use that term. But that I'm sure that the business experts would probably be much more familiar with it if I asked them.
Oh.
So I've got to.
Well, see, this is right, because the reason I asked this is that that may well be the case, and it may well also not be the case, and that there may be some difference between funds which are an SPV, so you create a vehicle, you transfer the funds to that vehicle, you put those in a portfolio, manage that portfolio, and you issue equity in that vehicle because it's a limited company and it has equity, versus funds which are a trust where the trustee manages the trust on behalf of the beneficiaries. I've always thought they're quite separate things. Some of the things Max was saying suggest they might be the same thing, or there's at least some kind of SPV in the context of a trust fund, but I'm not convinced it's necessarily the same thing. And if you're not coming across the term SPV, it may be because that's not relevant to the kinds of funds you're looking at, because it's the kind of fund that has nothing to do with an SPV. And that's what I'm trying to find out, at least at a top-level approximation, is what kinds of entity, what different structures of fund exist, and what kinds of entity do we need to worry about, so we can then declare success in at least identifying the legal entity forms that need to be in FIBO for business entities in order to support everything we need to be able to say about funds and collective investment vehicles.
According to that document I sent you, Mike, the legal form for an SPV may be a limited partnership, a limited liability company, a trust, or a corporation. There are also a number of vehicles that own the resistance to special legislation, such as real estate mortgage investment conduits, financial asset securitization investment trusts, regulated investment companies, and real estate investment trusts. So REMICs, facets, RICs, and RITs. So it's all in that document. I think that that'll explain the legal structure to you.
Fantastic, thank you. So with what's in that document, we've got what are the kinds of form SPV can take. That's going to really help us build out this fund's SPV. With trust funds, I thought trust funds were a completely different kind of fund that had nothing to do with SPVs, and now I'm not so sure. I'm hoping between us we can find out. So where is the trust? Is there also an SPV? Max, you were saying that the SPV acquires a portfolio and so on, and I didn't get to the end of what you were saying before we moved on to something else. So I'm still curious as to whether in the trust scenario there is also an SPV that there's or not, or the trust is the legal form of the fund in that case, and SPV is the legal form of the fund in another kind of fund, which is what I had always assumed. Is that correct or not?
Are you suggesting that a trust and an SPV is synonymous, or are you suggesting that there is a trust can be an SPV?
I'm not suggesting anything, but I'm pretty sure that both of those statements would be wrong. I've always thought they were wrong. I'm starting to question whether I was right in thinking they were wrong or not, and I'm dying to find out. That's about where I am. I've always assumed
I believe
they're completely different.
I can say with confidence that the latter that Mike said is true.
Really?
Yes.
But a trust can be one of the forms that an SPV takes.
A special purpose vehicle can be a trust, but not all trusts are special purpose vehicles.
Right. So we're saying that that is a true statement.
And, you know, again, I'll point you to that paper because I'm just reading right from it, not that I have any.
Oh, yeah,
Page
I've got
3.
it on my other screen now. Page
Just
3.
if you've got it, open it up to page 3. It tells you what their legal structure is.
I've got page 549.
Yeah, page 549. That's it. I'm sorry, 549.
Right.
550, and 550 is where I'm reading.
Great. SPVs, which are now pervasive in corporate finance, what's the value to organising corporate activity using SPVs? Well, that straight away implies that there are scenarios in which you do not use SPVs, as well as scenarios in which you do use SPVs, and we need to capture them both.
Right,
So,
and they explain that to you on the next page.
Fantastic. Explicit contractual arrangements that avoid, right, good. SPV or SPE, so they are synonymous, the legal entity created by the sponsor, good, transferring assets to the SPV. So we already have the sponsor of an SPV in our model somewhere, I know it. They have no purpose other than the transactions which they're created, yes, that agrees with the farmer definition we're just looking at. Legal form may be limited partnership, limited liability company, a trust, oh yes, or a corporation. That's interesting because that means the legal form for the SPV is broader than just legal persons, because trusts are not legal persons.
But I think it's the next 5 bullets that you need to read.
Yeah,
because they have specific characteristics.
Yes. Typically, off-balance sheet SPVs have the following characteristics. They are thinly capitalized, they have no independent management or employees, their administrative functions are performed by a trustee, who follows pre-specified rules with regard to receipt and distribution of cash. There are no other decisions. That's absolutely the kind of trustee role that Max was describing earlier, right? Assets held by the SPV are serviced by a servicing arrangement. Okay, that matches the farmer thing about how there's a portfolio manager and an asset servicer and so on that are different legal entities which have a role with regard to the SPV, good. And they are structured so that, as a practical matter, they cannot become bankrupt. So essentially, they are robot firms that have no employees. Of course, this makes an interesting challenge to the nice, simple change I made to the model earlier, that any legal person must be an organisation. But we'll ignore that for now. It's an organisation of which nobody is a member. So makes no substantive economic decisions, have no physical location, and cannot go bankrupt. Off-balance sheet financing arrangements take the form of R&D, limited partnerships, leasing transactions. Anyway, there's a whole lot of other ways SPVs can be used outside of our area as well. It raises important issues for the theory of the firm. That takes us back to Searle and all that research. Good. Right. So there we have some very detailed stuff in that paper, some of which I can model formally, some of which I modeled formally much earlier in the SPV models anyway. Let's just have a look and see if I can find any sensible model with this in. CDO, structured finance, asset-backed, common concepts.
So what's your question, Mike? Is your question does this thing exist, and where do we put it in the model? No. Special purpose vehicle has always been in the model, always existed. I used to think, until today, that funds which had a trust structure and funds that had an SPV structure were in no way related to each other, and that would appear not to be the case. But it still raises the question, are there funds which do not have a special purpose vehicle, as well as funds which do have a special purpose vehicle? So what are the range of kinds of funds
that can exist and the range of entities that we need to know about in order to be able to talk about that full range of kinds of fund? That is essentially my question.
And I believe, Mike, both are true.
Both of... Right, both of what? So the question is, are there funds which have a trust structure and not SPV?
And I think the answer to it is an SPV is only used when you want to remove a debt from your balance sheet.
Right.
So yes, you could have a trust structure that's not an SPV.
Right.
I think if you just read these few pages, you'll get it.
Yep.
If you ever want to have real fun, read a pooling and service agreement from all these things. It's like 300 pages, but it's all
Yeah.
yeah.
The thing is, yeah, I could read all those things, but until I've read them all and know something that the real business experts would know, I wouldn't know what is the range of things which can or can't, which may or may not exist. And that's what we really need to know here. We can find out a lot more about any given kind of trust once we know it exists, or any given kind of fund once we know it exists. But what we need to know now, which I rely on the business experts on this call with their business knowledge, is what is the range of kinds of things. So we're getting very much closer to that than we were at the beginning of this call, and that's very, very encouraging. There's a connection between trust and SPV, which I had never previously suspected, but it's not a connection which is universal or describes the only kind of fund that there is. I think that much is clear. So there's a trust structure which we understand in terms of the role of the trustee and the role of the fund unit holder. If the form that the SPV takes is not a company issued by shares, then clearly it doesn't have equity. So what then happens to the fund units? Or is there another limited company in that scenario in which the equity units are? Because clearly you can't have equity without being a legal legal person that has been formed by equity. Otherwise you wouldn't have equity, right?
Well, you have to be careful about, this is Jeff Brazo, Mike, you have to be careful about definition of equity in the sense that a lot of the special purpose vehicles, in fact, have an equity tranche that is used as the insurance for, for non-performing assets and so forth. That's sort of like the insurance fund, and there is equity involved there, in the vehicle, but it is not shareholder equity.
Oh, right. Yes, because I'm familiar with the equity tranche of a tranche security that we're looking at just now. But again, I've never seen any reason to cross-reference that to the fund model in any way. So this is not shareholder equity. That's the point, because you retain that equity and you issue the rest as debt in an MBS. Is there any parallel between that and the world of funds that anybody knows of? Or do we need to make sure that in this version of FIBO for business entities, we also have covered whatever we need to cover for mortgage-backed and asset-backed securities as well as the funds?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing about SPVs is that they can take a variety of forms, and a trust is only one of the forms that they've taken. As a matter of fact, the famous Abacus deal that blew up involving the Cleveland mortgages, the reason that it was able to be looked into and identify all of the components of it is that it in fact was a trust that had a trustee that was of public record. I'm sure that there are other special purpose vehicles that are over-the-counter type of contracts that don't have that same legal status.
So that's the point, because if the form of a special purpose vehicle can be a trust, then it means that the range of forms is any potentially liable entity, any legal entity, not just, in fact, any formal organization, and not just any legal person. I think at the moment we have it modelled that the thing which could be an SPV must be a legal person. It sounds as though that needs to be changed.
Well, it is the area in which a lot of high-powered firms got very creative, and so a lot of things happened. I mean, you just look at what Enron did with SPVs to get the debt off of their balance sheet, and that was not a very healthy use of the vehicle.
Right, and therefore all the more important to be able to model it.
Isn't that what the like companies like Washington Mutual did as well when they formed the PSAs, and they declared that they were not going to be because they're off book entries, they weren't going to be reporting to the SEC on them?
Yeah, it's quite possible. I mean, the whole thing about you put something into an off balance sheet vehicle, you're basically a lot of the gimmicks were you take something which should be an asset or a liability or a debt, and you turn it into something which looks like it's a future income stream, like a payback. And so you basically move something from the balance sheet to the income statement at a future time.
Yeah, it's called fraud.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's all the lawsuits. That's all the lawsuits that Schneiderman is launching right now.
Fantastic. Good. So we're slightly over our time, but that's given me a lot of pointers. And Mike, especially, thanks for that document, and the extracts I read, I think, answered a lot of the questions I was having. But what we thought in our little strawman diagram we started with was several different kinds of legal form are actually interconnected in ways that we didn't even imagine, and may well be interconnected in more ways that they ought not to be, but will be, and which we therefore need to be able to capture, and that means keeping it simple and high level. So that's been very helpful. Thanks for staying on. I know we're just over time. Any last minute comments or things I've missed or miswrote or need to go back to before we sign off?
Where are you headed next week, Mike?
Oh, very good question. Yeah, where do we want to go next week? I can action obviously the stuff we talked about this time. It sounds like we need a closer connection between the 2 or 3 different kinds of SPV that we identified during our work with securities. I think I've almost answered my own question on scoping, that we need to think not only about fund-related entities, but also mortgage-backed and asset-backed security-related entities in order to make sure that we have a business entities model which covers everything we're going to need to talk about in the future when we model securities and funds and all the rest of it. So I think if I model as much of that as I can and end up with a lot of rather more coherent questions than I had this week, I think that will be our agenda for next week. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Fantastic.
You might want to consider looking at synthetic CDOs as a interesting test case, because what they do, they combine they combine the CDO structure, but they add in third-party collateral default swaps, credit default swaps as part of the insurance. So it's an even more complex structure. Yeah.
I tried to model those, and we didn't quite get stuck, but it was yeah, they're in here somewhere, synthetic CDO. But there are open questions around which direction that CDS went, and we've got a very detailed model of the CDS. Linking that back to entities could be interesting, because I'm not sure we did justice to that. We've got pools there involved, and the insurance of the pool, and all sorts of stuff.
Right.
Yes, thank you. We've got very complex models of securities, but linking that to the SPVs, we could do a bit more. There you go, synthetic debt SPV. There it is, right there.
Well, that's it. Yeah, the challenge is they act like both an instrument and an entity, and so they have a bit of a chameleon nature.
A bit like funds. Sometimes the word fund refers to the thing with the accusative or an and sometimes the word fund refers to a formal kind of business entity, and sometimes it refers to a pool of assets.
Right.
Sounds like we've got a real commonality there between the whole tranche securities world and the whole funds world. So good. That's yeah. I'll look at that as well. And do have a little rummage on the website.